Welcome to this second workshop in a series on compositing effects in Adobe Premiere. In this workshop, I want to talk about the difference mat effect and how you can use it in order to insert yourself into a virtual environment or scenery like this. What is really important for this effect is the position and the stabilization of your camera. You have to use a tripod for this effect, and it doesn't matter if you use a camcorder, a more professional camera, or your cell phone. You have to stabilize your camera because you can't move the camera during this shot. The idea is that you subtract a background image from the pixels of a foreground image, and in areas where pixels overlap with different colors, these pixels will remain opaque in the end effect. I've already prepared some materials for you that you can download in the description section below this video to follow along in Premiere. So without further ado, let's get into the screen view and let's get started with this effect.
I've already downloaded the example files, and I just quickly wanted to show you what we're actually going to create in this workshop today. If you take a close look at the example vase push example, you'll get an idea for the final outcome of this workshop. Okay, so as you can see, and to be perfectly honest, this is not the best possible result that you can get from a keying operation. When you take a closer look, you see that there are certain areas that are transparent. My shoes are, for example, completely transparent, almost completely transparent. There's parts of my clothing, some of my hands, some fingers that start to disappear, even some of the hair here. And so I wanted to use this example to show you also where the limitations of this effect are, and that as a kind of a recommendation, you should probably almost always use the chroma keying effect with a green screen in order to get some very realistic looking keying effects. Nevertheless, this actually works okay still in a situation where you don't have access to a green screen, and also in situations where maybe you need to work from at home and you don't have access to facilities that would allow you some more precise operations or a better environment to shoot your source footage. So you also see that I have my vase in here again, which I use as a starting image, and I have already the cutout vase that I showed you in the last workshop how to do that in Photoshop to create transparency around the vase, so we can easily use it on a separate layer in Premiere. And I have a background that I created in Photoshop as well, which just simulates a gray photo screen or photo studio background that we will use today. There is a sound file that gives you the idea of this, scraping sound when I push the vase across the floor to make the effect a little bit more realistic. And then I finally have my two source footage files that I'm just quickly wanting to open here in QuickTime and show to you. One that is titled background and the other one that is titled foreground. And I just quickly wanted to open these and just illustrate and talk a little bit more about how the difference mat effect is working and what we actually need for a successful difference mat effect. As the name implies, it basically compares two frames from video files in two different tracks. So this would be my background track right here. And then my second track would be the foreground track right here. And it basically looks at differences of these two video images. And you see that there's lots of similarities in both of them where nothing is changing. The background is staying the same. But there are certain parts that are different, mainly me being inserted in the frame right here, that we can use in this effect. And basically through this comparison of both of these frames and both of these video layers, we can render parts where pixels are very close to being the same transparent, and we can render parts where pixels are actually quite different from each other, different enough beyond a certain threshold, and render these parts opaque. So that's why it's very important, as I mentioned in my introduction, that the frame of reference stays always the same. As you can see here, these are exactly the two same camera angles that I use in my background footage and in my foreground footage. And furthermore, also that, for example, your lighting is not changing during the shot. Also, you shouldn't zoom in or zoom out or change any other camera settings, such as the aperture or, for example, the shutter speed while you're recording. A couple of other things, and I just quickly bring up the example file here again that I wanted to talk about in terms of best practices for difference matte effects. Are some of the things you see here, for example. So this is this hole in my pants that you see here is actually from an outlet that is in the studio space. And although the hue of my pants, so the color of my pants, the blue is different from the slightly grayish, brownish color of the receptacles of this outlet, they still are being rendered transparent because the value is very close. And so you should also try to avoid backgrounds that have similar values and hues than, for example, the clothes or the color of your skin or the color of anything in the foreground that you would like to have opaque in front of them. Also, and I can move this a little bit further along, here's actually another outlet you just saw. You see right here, this is actually one of the columns in the space that starts showing up again. And this has to do with the fact that I'm fairly close to the column and I actually cast a shadow onto the column. So stepping a little bit further away from your background is actually also a good idea in order to prevent shadows from being detected as differences in your shot as well. Also, and you see that I'm pushing the boundaries here a little bit as well, try to avoid movements that are very fast and try to avoid movements that are complex. So I have figured out that very small movements, hardly any movement at all, or very subtle movements only are actually working very well with this effect. Whenever you have fast movements, movements that are very complex, pushes the effect to its limit. So let's actually go into Premiere and let's take a look at how we can put all of these together and what we should observe when we work with the difference matte effect. I start with an empty project, a new project that I create in Premiere, and I will save it in my Compositing 2 materials folder. Again, the idea is that I keep all of my files in the same folder for each of the projects that I'm working on. I create a new project and I will name this Pushing the Vase, for example. I'll save it in this folder on the desktop of my Compositing 2 materials that I just downloaded. Choose that and say OK. And again, if you see any kind of different arrangement of the windows here between source window, program window, timeline window, and project window, if you don't see any of these or they're kind of mixed up and you can't replicate the look of the windows that we see here, it is easy enough to go into the view mode, in the window mode, workspaces, and then choose the editing workspace in order to get the same view that we're also using in these workshops. I'll start by importing my materials for this workshop. Double click into my project window. That brings up my file selection window, and so I go to desktop, Compositing 2 materials, and I need quite a few files for that. I already know that I need my background still image, that photo studio backdrop that I showed you just a minute ago. Need my background.mp4 file, my foreground image. I need my sound file, and I also need the vase.psd file for this workshop. So again, I held down the command key. On Windows, it's probably the control key. If that doesn't work, you quickly have to look that up, which keyboard shortcut allows you to select multiple files at the same time on the PC. And then I hit import. I select again my individual layers for the Photoshop file. There's only one layer in there, so there is not much more to select here. And then after I imported all of these files, I need to create a new empty sequence. So I do that again by going to File, New Sequence. And I choose again the digital SLR folder in my templates and my presets on the left-hand side. Go to the 1080p and then select the DSLR 1080p 30 setting. Now I can already start dragging some footage into my sequence that has been created in my timeline window. So I start with the background layer. So I drag and drop this in here. And again, probably want to move that right to the beginning of the sequence and then temporarily zooming in just a little bit so you can select and take a look at the material a little bit closer, easier. And then I bring in the foreground, MPEG-4 as well. Now you see that we already have two soundtracks, and in fact we only need one, which is the one from me standing in the scene, which is right now in audio track A2. So in order to get rid of audio track A1, which right now is directly connected to the background layer that's in V1, I need to go and select actually just either one of them, highlight them in here in the sequence window, and then I go to Clip and say Unlink. And now I can select the soundtrack individually, independent of my video track, hit delete, which deletes that soundtrack. And then I can push my final soundtrack that I want to use. Again, this is the soundtrack from the clip in which I walk in the foreground here. I can push this up into track A1. The next thing I need to actually do is I need to quickly rearrange the video tracks here a little bit more. So I need to push my foreground MP4 clip up into track V3, and I need to push my background clip into track V2 so that I create an empty spot for my background still image that I will bring in, and I drag and drop this into my V1 track. Again, you see that this image is very short in terms of its duration, but if you navigate your arrow key relatively close to its endpoint, you can actually click and drag whenever that arrow key changes to this red arrow, and that allows you to extend the duration of this still image in your timeline. So we're already at the point right now where we can start to apply the difference matte effect onto the clips. So again, I have my foreground clip, which is this one in video track V3. And if I quickly turn this off, turn this invisible, you see in video track 2, V2, right underneath it, I have my background clip. And then if I turn this invisible, you see in my video track V1, at the very bottom layer of all these video layers, I have my still image, which is the background still.psd file. So I'll turn all of these visible again. And now I need to go to the Effects panel in the project window, click on Effects, and then I can simply type into the search field difference. Don't even have to type it all the way out. There's just one effect under Video Effects, keying Difference Matte. And I will take this effect and then drag and drop it onto the foreground MP4 clip. So that does a couple of things. First of all, it puts a red bar probably in your timeline, which means that you may experience some problems playing back the results of this operation in real time, and you may have to pre-render some of these effects. But you also see how I disappear from the frame. And so we now need to go and fine-tune this effect a little bit more so that we can truly benefit from it. So I'll do that by double-clicking into the foreground layer in track V3, double-click into it, which brings it up in the source window. And I go to the Effect Controls panel that allows me access to the different settings of my Difference Matte effect that you can find on the left-hand side toward the bottom of this window. The first thing I want to do is I actually want to change the view from final output to matte only, and this is very similar now to the ultra key effect that I introduced in another workshop, where we should see a white silhouette, white representing opaque pixels in front of a black background, and black in this case represents transparent pixels. This is also the reason why we don't really see any of the effect right now, that everything is transparent. And this has to do with the fact that the difference layer, the layer we want to use to compare the foreground layer with, is by default set, in my case, to video 3. So it's set to itself. We have to change this because we have to set it to our background video layer, which is in track V2. So I will do that, and that should already give me a first reading of the effect, which is not too bad. You see these are just the default settings, 15% matching tolerance, and then matching softness is at 0, and the blur before difference is also at 0 in this case. But as you move your playback head through the timeline, you start seeing some of these artifacts already appearing. And I would like to use just a moment in order to hopefully fine-tune this effect just a little bit more. So again, we do want to get rid of everything that is white outside of my silhouette. And ideally, we would like to get everything that is black inside of my silhouette white again, which in this case we just can't possibly do. There wasn't enough of a difference between the color of my shoes and the color of the background, specifically in terms of the value of both of these layers. So the shoes will always remain transparent. But we could now try to work with the matching tolerance, and just here feel free to, drag this slider around and see what's happening. So if you increase the matching tolerance, you will lose some of the white pixels outside of the silhouette right here. So they're almost gone right now, but you also increase the transparency of some of the parts inside of my silhouette, which is too bad and which we also don't want. So playing with these settings now is really all about finding a balance between the silhouette and the whiteness of everything that is inside of the silhouette, and then just the transparency outside of that silhouette. So you can also try and go to 10, for example, here. So bring in some of that white, and then start working with the matching softness here. Set that to 4%, for example. And you already see how at least it renders it not fully opaque, but semi-opaque. So if things start looking grayish here, this means that they're only 50% opaque, for example. And then you could even play a little bit with the blur before difference slider as well to try and smooth out some of the artifacts that you see when you are working with the effect. In this case, you would see how this looks much more pixelated right now, especially if you were to zoom into that, and it looks a little bit more smoothed out right now with the setting of 4. So feel free to experiment here as much as you like. I would probably choose something around 10% for the matching tolerance, 6% for my matching softness, and 4 for the blur before difference. But this, of course, also depends heavily on where you are at in your timeline. And so re-investigating this effect at different parts across your timeline will be really important to get it just right. If you have a situation where you would need to adjust some of these settings over time, you see that all of these settings have this stopwatch icon in front of them, which is an indicator that you can use keyframes in order to animate them over time. So slowly increase, for example, the matching tolerance, or decrease the matching softness if that were something you wanted to do with your footage. Let's see if I go just a little bit higher, so maybe go to 12% here. I'm still not too happy with this shadow area right here, and this truly comes from me standing too close to the background that I want to subtract in this case, and me casting a shadow that then offset the threshold and basically made some of the pixels of the background and the foreground show up here as well. So, but this is probably as good as we can get this effect. And now let's take a look at what it looks like in the final sequence. So we can change our view from matte only to final output. and we should see now myself being inserted into the space again, but we still don't see the background still layer, and this has to do with the fact that the video background MP4 in track V2 is still visible. So I need to turn off the visibility of that in order to get rid of that layer, and that truly now inserts me into that background context. Then you can already take a look. And now we can move on to the second part of this workshop, which is kind of a recap a little bit of our first workshop working with keyframes in the context of compositing. And the vase, and let's go back to the project window for that. So project right here. If you ever don't see any of these tabs that you're actually looking for, like the effects tab, we use that quite frequently, or then the project tab, which is right here on the left hand side, you can click on these arrows in the top right corner of the window, and then simply going back to the tab that you like and select that from the drop down list right there. So I want to use the vase in layer number 4, in video track number 4, so it needs to be in the foreground. And I also extend that out, and you see again how large it actually is. It covers everything up, and so I need to go into the effect controls for that layer. I basically double click the layer in my timeline window or sequence window, which brings up the layer in my source window. I go to effect controls, and then I can easily play with the scale property right here using my mouse and sliding that back and forth to get to a certain scale. Once you have the scale in a more manageable size, you can also double click on that layer and then start moving it around in your composition to where you want it to go. And this was in fact how we started to animate the position properties of this vase in the first workshop that I showed you last week. So now what I want to do is I need to make sure that I have the point where I start pushing this vase, which is actually right here. So I put my playback head in the timeline right where, and this is right around 4 seconds, so 4 seconds and 4 frames, where I start pushing the vase. And in fact, I wanted to make myself just a little bit smaller, so I double click into foreground, go to effect controls, and then set the scale to around 70%. So again, to play with that idea of scale just a little bit more and overemphasize that. And then match my, if you click in that, double click in that video layer again, match my gesture and the position of my hands also to the position of this vase. So what I need to do is I need to arrange both in such a way that when I double click on the video, click on my figure right here, you see how the left border of this video, and this is where I want the vase to be pushed off of the side of the screen, that needs to match up with the side of my video frame here as well. And so then I just move it down just slightly to the bottom as well, so that basically my new video frame, that's now only 70% of the original size, is matching up with the left and the bottom borders of my composition video or composition window. And then I double click into the vase again, and I match this up with the position of my hands right here. And this will be the starting point of my animation. Probably move this down just a little bit so that we see that line on top a little bit better. And then I double click into layer 1 vase, which is in track V4, bring up its effect controls, and enable the keyframes for its position property again. So this is just like in the previous workshop. I set a start point for this animation in time, which starts at 4 seconds and 4 frames. And then I play back the video all the way over here, where basically this vase is exiting the screen. I move my playback head to, this is 12 seconds and 3 frames in this case. And then I change the position of my vase, move that all the way over there, somewhere around, let's say 420 roughly around minus 470 pixels on the x-axis. And that creates automatically a second keyframe, and now I can already see how everything looks. It's pretty off actually, so I probably should go back and adjust this keyframe at the end a little bit more. So I hold down the shift key on my keyboard so that I actually jump magnetically with my playback head to that last keyframe right here, that I'm sure that I'm actually on that keyframe. And then I just adjust the number here just a little bit and see. Yeah, I'm already getting a little bit closer. Just this even more. So 280, around 280. Let's see what that looks like. And that's already pretty close. And now we do the fine tuning. So go here right at around 5 or 6 seconds, and then adjust the position of the vase a little bit closer to my hands. Maybe jump a couple more seconds ahead. So right here, adjust this a little bit better. And here looks pretty good. And now at the very end, I need to adjust this back because it seems like it's slowing down. Yeah, so just adjust this at the very end back to around, I don't know, 450. Let's see what it looks like. No, I think I was pretty close with my 500 in the beginning. Let's say 530. Yeah, something like that. Okay, so let's play it back and let's see what this looks like. Good. Maybe just adjusting it a little bit more toward the end here, at that last frame. This is the hardest one of them all because we can't see the vase anymore. We kind of have to guess. So maybe even going more towards 600 even. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, and so I think that's not too bad. So now we're ready to export this. And again, we need to make sure that the sequence window is selected so that there's a blue border around that window. You can just simply click inside that window one more time. And then we go to File, Export, Media. And you can kind of preview it here at the bottom. See what it looks like. This is pretty good. And then you go to export settings, make sure that the format is set to H.264. The output name, and this is also then an opportunity to save it again into that folder on the desktop. So we go to Desktop, Composition 2, and save this as pushing the vase.mp4. Hit save, and then we can go and take a look at our video settings. Width and height are 1920 by 1080, 29.97 frames per second, progressive field order and square pixels aspect ratio for the pixels. This is all correct, and then under bitrate setting we go again to our VBR2 pass, select, I don't know, probably 12 here, well, 11 maybe, 11 and 13. So this is anywhere between 10 and 15 megabits per second is probably a pretty good setting for this size of your frame and for this frame rate as well. And then in the audio settings, you just need to make sure that you have the AAC encoder and the best possible quality at 48 kilohertz, high audio quality, and 320 kilobits per second. Finally, you can hit export here, and that will render the video and turn it into a standalone video file that then you can use in order to upload to YouTube and to share with the rest of the class for the presentations of this assignment. So before we conclude this workshop, I just wanted to highlight one more thing in here. And again, this has to do with the fact that this effect is less than ideal for, let's say, a very photorealistic representation of a compositing effect, for example. So you see how my shoes are completely disappearing, how there are these transparent areas in my pants that are not supposed to be there. There's a few minor shadows right here underneath my arm. So rather, sometimes with these effects, if this is really the only effect that you're stuck with, that you can work with, because you don't have access to a chroma keying environment or a green screen, for example, you can actually work in a more expressive way maybe with this effect. Rather than trying to make things look very representational, you can actually go back into your effect settings, and I double click on the foreground MP4 layer here one more time, go into the effect controls, and then take a closer look at my difference matte effect again here, where maybe you want to make use of, you know, some more expressive settings right here, turning the matching softness to 30%, the blur before difference to 20, for example, and then the matching tolerance. You can experiment with that as well. I wonder what it would look like when it's set to 5. And so here you get already something that is much more abstracted, but that over time when you play this back still reveals the properties of actually some human motion and movement that is created by a talent in your video. So let's just play that back quickly. So what is interesting, that you create a much more ghost-like appearance with this, but this may actually be something that you want to explore in terms of your concept for this video, and this could be really quite interesting if it can be applied to the right idea behind the work. And then, of course, some of these flaws that you see here in the footage that appear through the difference matte effect are maybe not so visible anymore after all. So feel free to experiment with these settings as much as you can, and as much as you would like to, and just see which effects in the end, or which settings of this effect in the end create the most desirable visual outcome, and one that maybe even lends itself to a creative exploration of ideas and concepts. So with this, I would like to conclude the workshop. I hope you enjoy working with this effect, although it can be a little bit frustrating, as you've seen in this workshop. But maybe you find some really creative or really unique and novel ways to use it in your project.